after the Battle of Manila Bay, the Olympia does a round the world tour, brings the sailors home to New York, goes through a bunch of ceremonies there, gets refitted, but then gets reassigned to, is it the Atlantic Station, and does some peacekeeping. Well, I wouldn't say peacekeeping, but does operations within the Caribbean. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So Olympia, after a major refit at the Boston Navy Yard in 1902, got assigned to be flagship in the Atlantic. And so her main area of operations ended up being the Caribbean. So from 1902 up until 1914, with one small interval of being taken out of service for a refit, ended up being a flagship in the Caribbean. And so the idea with that was part of America. After the Spanish-American War, the United States now had possessions in Puerto Rico, the more or less control of Cuba, and a couple of other former smaller Spanish possessions, but then also wanted to make sure that Europe stayed out. So this was a follow-on to things like the Monroe Doctrine of the United States saying, this is our sphere of influence. You know, you don't need to be here trying to take over, doing all these other things. So Olympia ended up staying in the Caribbean and then off of like Cuba, off of Honduras and Central America, just to be part of this larger operational force throughout that time. That Olympia went through a couple of different deployments, one even to Mexico in 1914 after the United States intervention in Veracruz. Olympia ended up being one of the ships that rotated through that station, patrolling off of Mexico, and ended up around Haiti during the United States intervention in Haiti, also in Nicaragua. She ended up landing some Marines or being part of the larger force there in Nicaragua. So she stayed active in service, in the Caribbean all through that period.
Interesting. You brought up the Marines, and so I wanted to kind of revisit that real quickly. Did she normally have a complement of Marines assigned to her, or were they part of the other ships within the fleet that was being deployed?
As a flagship, she had Marines. She had Marines up until just the beginning of World War One.
Okay.
That was part of how that worked. That especially with the larger ships, they all had a Marine contingent. But okay. Olympia, especially because she was designated a flagship.
Okay, so there for a long period of her operational deployments, she had Marines assigned to her, and I'm assuming that they did typical Marine type duties, but they also assisted where they could, especially when it came to things like battle and such like that. Okay.
Yeah, so they often manned a specific gun, and had duties as infantrymen, as riflemen, as all Marines do.
Okay, very nice. Okay, so after quite a bit of work over a long period of time in the Caribbean, I know that now we're rolling into World War I, and the combatants are there, and obviously this is a world war. This isn't just located in one area. But Olympia was assigned to some different duties during World War I. Can you tell us about those?
Sure. The U.S. Navy ended up being the first branch of the American Armed Forces to get involved in World War I, and they went in almost immediately after the American Declaration of War in April 1917. So Olympia was a pretty old ship by that point. Keep in mind, she had been launched in 1895, or went into service in 1895. And so had been around for quite a long time. She immediately got assigned to being the part of what's called the Atlantic Squadron. So she was part of a patrol force that sailed the American coast to keep away U-boats and other combatants, and ended up getting reassigned to convoy duty. So she took one trip across the Atlantic as a convoy escort, and then ended up running aground and ended up going through a big refit in the New York Navy Yard. And so that kind of changed the course of things for Olympia, going aground, because that took her off that Atlantic station and ended up getting the ship more directly involved in war service.
So after convoy duties, where was she sent next?
To Russia, of all places. So later in 1917, after the Russians had made their specific peace with Germany, and this was part of the Russian Revolution that was going on, that whenever Russia pulled out of the war, the Allies, which were Britain, France, Italy, the United States, had stockpiled a lot of supplies in Archangel, Russia, and Murmansk, Russia. And they were afraid that not only the Germans were going to go get it, but also some of the people fighting in Russia. So there were all sorts of factions that were trying to fight against the Tsar and some of the other groups in Russia. So they didn't want the stuff to get scattered to the four winds. That Britain and France approached the Wilson administration to send an American force to Russia to be part of an inter-allied operation to not only secure supplies, but try to stabilize things in the area. So Olympia got the job. She was sent to Charleston, South Carolina, landed, her Marines changed out some of the crew, got some new equipment and sailed across the Atlantic, went to Britain, and then straight into Murmansk, Russia. And so stayed there for the summer of 1918 and almost into 1919. So she pulled out in December of 1919 or 1918.
So when she was on station there in Russia, what were some of the things that her and her crew were doing?
One of the main things was just being a military presence to wave the flag to say, look, this is the Allies that are here. We're not going to let anything happen. And she ended up doing a little bit of patrolling between Murmansk and Archangel. That there were Russian ships that were in Murmansk. Some of the sailors had deserted because of the Russian Revolution. And Olympia's sailors ended up helping man a couple of Russian destroyers, just to help keep them in operation. One of the main things the sailors ended up doing was landing a large force. So there were 108 sailors and a couple of officers who landed in Murmansk to be an infantry force. So they acted as a police force and they ended up fighting as infantrymen throughout the summer and early fall of 1918, making a big push toward Archangel. So they ended up being part of an inter-allied naval infantry brigade, fighting alongside French and British sailors, making this attack on some of the Russian positions between Murmansk and Archangel.
And we're talking on land, my territory, not in the sea. Interesting. Wow. All right.
And it's an interesting situation because they hadn't gone equipped to do that. And so whenever they left the United States, they had like 1903 Springfield rifles, and the Navy at that point typically got older stuff. So they talked about how the extractors constantly broke. Pieces were breaking on these rifles. They ended up getting Model 1895 machine guns to go with them on this voyage. So whenever they landed at Murmansk, there was a stockpile of weapons that were there. So they ended up putting their 03 Springfields and their machine guns in the back on the ship, and then using some of these Russian weapons. So they ended up using Russian rifles, British machine guns, British helmets, French hand grenades. I mean, all sorts of stuff. It's such a hodgepodge to see the photographs of these guys and all of their equipment and how they went into combat.
It sounds like we need to do a tidbit on just that operation alone, because that's very unique and probably something that, again, most Americans aren't going to remember because, and I was the same way. When you think of World War I, you think of the Western Front in France, and that's it. You think of trench fighting. You don't think of all these other things that go on in the convoys leading up to it or the aftermath of it, in truly a world global conflict. So we might have to revisit that and talk a little bit more about how they're fighting in all these other nations' gear and equipment to complete a mission that they weren't really prepared for. But in true American spirit, they went ahead and accomplished it as it is.
Well, putting pressure on Russia was a strategic move too. And this is maybe something to come back to. One of the things that worried the Allies was that after Russia pulled out of the war, that meant Germany could shuffle all of these forces from the West or the Eastern Front to the Western Front, which made it imperative for the American forces to get rolling as quickly as they could. So a lot of the major offensives in 1918 were part of this larger picture. And so part of why Britain and France wanted to apply pressure in Russia was to keep the Germans off balance and make sure that they didn't transfer all of their forces from one front to the other.
Oh, absolutely. That makes sense. All right. Well, was that the end of Olympia's operational missions, or did she have something follow on after that?
No, the end of hostilities in World War I didn't end Olympia's operational service. She ended up, after leaving Murmansk, went to Great Britain, briefly back to the United States, and then back into action, going into the Mediterranean and Adriatic to be part of the larger peacekeeping force that stayed in Europe after the end of World War I. That it was such an incredibly destabilizing thing to have Austria and Germany more or less knocked off, in all these small states, especially in the Baltic area, that were, what do you do? So Olympia ended up spending a lot of time around Italy, around Austria, landed sailors as a larger police force who served alongside French and British sailors that were a part of an infantry force to help keep the peace in places like Venice and Spalato, Austria, and ended up briefly going even up around Constantinople to doing a lot of this peacekeeping work and being a U.S. Navy presence as part of a larger Allied presence to make sure things stayed stable. And they're also keeping on station, that as the Russian Revolution got ramped up, this is all going on in 1919, 20, 21, that all of these navies stayed on station to help keep things stable during that too. That the U.S. Navy was one of the last groups present and at the final fall of Russia, more or less, around the Crimea in the early 1920s, that the U.S. Navy helped evacuate a lot of people who were trying to flee the Crimea. So U.S. Navy ships took a lot of these people down to Turkey and then into Greece to get them out of Russia at that point. So they stayed on station all the way up until around 1921.
Well, that's amazing. She has quite the operational history, more than just the one giant battle that she's most remembered for, but that definitely set her tone for her service throughout the Navy. And truly a global force. She was all over the planet, flying the flag and participating in operations. So, hey, Luke, thanks for taking us through that. That again, you and I could sit here for hours having this conversation because it gets more interesting the more layers you start peeling back on the USS Olympia and what she's done for our nation, let alone just the fact that in 1921 she was selected to lead and bring home the unknown soldier. So thank you for that opportunity to go through those.
Absolutely. Glad to talk with you about it.
All right. Well, definitely have more on the future for us to talk about some other different aspects of Olympia. So until then, be safe out there.
Thanks. You too.